lived in our bathtub for a while.
Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us again for our community Bible study. Tonight we're going to look at chapter 18 as we continue in verse 3. We're looking at the Antichrist political, economic, and commercial world system. It's described to us in this chapter, but the focus of this chapter is really on judgment and destruction. This is the last chapter in the book of Revelation before the return of Jesus Christ, is to set up his kingdom in verse 19, or chapter 19. So here tonight we're getting a glimpse of the final form of world government under the Antichrist. A government that exists in the time of the tribulation right up until the time that Jesus Christ comes to destroy it. Now if you remember, this final world system is called Babylon the Great. But it's a system that's centered in a city. And it's reasonable to believe that the city of Babylon is an actual rebuilt city. And it's the capital city of this final world empire. We saw in chapter 17 that there was a religious system also called Babylon that was destroyed by this economic or commercial system. And so now all the religious components that have become one with Babylon the Great, the mother of all false religion, and have been manifested now in the worship of the Antichrist, just as if he were God. And last week we learned that the whole world was involved in it with this Babylonian system. The whole world's engaged in this commercial, materialistic, secular enterprise. The whole world is worshiping the Antichrist. And all the nations are caught up in this lustful passion for materialism. And the prophecy of Revelation chapter 14, verse 8, has literally come true here in chapter 18. As the judgment predicted in chapter 14 unfolds, we read that in verse 2. Chapter 18, verse 2 says, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a home for demons and a haunt for every evil spirit, a haunt for every unclean and detestable bird. For all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. The kings of the earth committed adultery with her, and the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. And so what this angel is doing is making a declaration of judgment, pronouncing judgment on Babylon the Great, speaking as from the throne of God, as if it had already happened. And this, by the way, is also indicated by the words of the prophet Isaiah. Let me just remind you of Isaiah chapter 13 at verse 17 down to verse 22. Isaiah says, see, I will stir up against them the Medes, who do not care for silver and have no delight in gold. Their bows will strike down the young men. They will have no mercy on infants, nor will they look with compassion on children. Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the glory of Babylonia's pride, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. She will never be inhabited or lived in through all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherd will rest his flocks there. But desert creatures will lie there. Jackals will fill their houses. There the owls will dwell. There the wild goats will leap about. Hyenas will howl in their strongholds. Jackals in their luxurious palaces. Her time is at hand, and her days will not be prolonged. Here, with the knowledge and the sovereign insight of God, the prophet Isaiah skips from the historical fulfillment of the defeat of Babylon by the Medes to the ultimate destruction of Babylon when it's totally overthrown, never to be inhabited or lived in from generation to generation by our mighty God. And so you see here, as in many prophecies, there's often a double fulfillment of prophecy. As the prophet writes, he's looking historically, and then he's also looking eschatologically. He's looking at the end times, and something off in the future. And so in verse 3, it tells us there that this judgment is coming about because of the worldwide influence of this satanic commercial system. The whole world has become allies with this system of commerce that includes the worship of the Antichrist. Not just the people, but it says the nations of the earth have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. even growing rich from her excessive luxuries. The people of the world are intoxicated with a lust that sweeps across the world. The kings of the earth are involved in it. The merchants of the earth have become rich. And so it's a prosperous system. But as I mentioned to you last week, there's something that's quite remarkable about the fact that it prospers, considering what is going on in the world during the period of tribulation. Remember, this started with the 7 seal judgments, followed by 7 trumpet judgments, which really begin to heat up about the midpoint, 3.5 years into the tribulation, and then followed by the 7 bowl judgments, which are the very end. And so at this point, the Antichrist empire has already seen 7 seal judgments and the 7 trumpet judgments, which have already drastically altered the face and even the climate of the world. If you remember earlier in the book of Revelation chapter 8, you find that there's hail and fire mixed with blood thrown down to the earth. A third of the earth is burned up. A third of the trees are burned up. The green grass burned up. Something like a huge mountain burning with fire is thrown into the sea. A third of the sea becomes blood. A third of the creatures in the sea that had life died. A third of the ships were destroyed. And then this great star named Wormwood fell from heaven like a burning torch, falling on a third of the rivers and the springs of the waters. And so it's quite amazing to think that the world can still be commercially prosperous in the midst of this kind of devastation. And what we discover here in chapter 18 is that the merchants of the earth are continuing to move products and resources around the world. They're engaged in shipping and transportation on sea and land, and they're providing for factories with natural resources which are being destroyed as fast as you can speak. We've read about forests that are being destroyed. The land is being destroyed, water is being destroyed, even the air is being destroyed by the smoldering, burning smoke, which will undoubtedly affect the balance of our carbon dioxide and oxygen in the air. And so obviously the Antichrist economic system has got to be suffering. And it's got to depend on manpower. But again, we've already seen millions and millions of people that have been slaughtered. And the world system is going to depend upon the consumption to have a successful economy. Yet as people are killed, the consumer pool gets smaller and smaller. And so the system being successful really shows the ingenuity of Satan and the power of the Antichrist. And yet it's systematically being dismantled as all of its necessary components, and the sea, the land, the air, even manpower, even consumers for this market begin to die off. And yet today we find our world is getting ready for the Antichrist's great flourishing economy. The world is clamoring for that. And last week we saw judgment pronounced, a judgment that honestly is inevitable on this morally bankrupt and prosperous society. But God's judgment is something that can be avoided and must be avoided. Notice verse 4. Let's pick up in Revelation chapter 18. As we hear a call of mercy, a call to avoid the judgment, verse 4 says, "Then I heard another voice from heaven say, 'Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues.'" So here we find that God is calling believers. He's calling to his own who would repent, who would disentangle themselves from this world system. And remember now, all through this time of judgment, that God has been saving people. God is saving an innumerable number of people from every tongue, tribe, and people and nation, as described in chapter 7. God is saving Israel, and so we know that the Jews are certainly turning to Christ. 144,000 of them have already been out preaching the gospel. The angel flying across the sky preaching the gospel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. These things are all happening. And so out these 7 years, there's been this evangelistic fervor resulting in the greatest harvest of souls the world has ever known. And many of those who would come to Jesus would be martyred for their faith. They'll be martyred because they would refuse to take the mark of the beast and they will pay for their lives. Others obviously will survive. And the temptation for survivors may be to get caught up in this world system. And it's certainly not unlike the temptation for us who are told today, not to love the world. We're not to love the world or the things of the world. We who are reminded not to be conformed to this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. And yet, day by day, family and friends may apply pressure to believers today as well as in the time of tribulation. Added to that is the pressure to survive. It's the basic need to eat, to buy and sell things. And all of that may apply pressure, causing some of them to get caught up in this, some to become involved even within the confines of Babylon. And God warned in verse 4, he says, come out of her, my people. Come out. And so, God's call may be from sovereignty, as he's calling people who've been set apart from eternity past. This is a call with a sovereign mind. He may know there's still those there that are on the brink of repenting. And there may be those who maybe have come to faith and have become entangled once again. And to those people, he calls them to come out. And yet from all of sovereignty, from all time, he says, come to faith in my son Jesus. Come to faith in Jesus Christ. And come out of that system. But whatever it is and to whomever it is, the point is to get out before it falls. Get out before you get caught in it. Because if you get caught in it, you're not going to be able to enter the kingdom, and you're not going to experience the coming of Christ, which of course is a glorious reality. And so he says, get out before you get caught in the fury of God's wrath. Get out before you get caught in the wrath that's going to fall upon this world system. And by the way, the prophets have said the same thing for centuries. This is certainly nothing new. Isaiah chapter 48 and verse 20 says, leave Babylon, flee from the Babylonians. Flee, get out, said Isaiah. Get out of there. The judgment of God is going to fall. And then there's Jeremiah. Jeremiah in chapter 50 and in chapter 51. Listen to what Jeremiah says in verse 8 of chapter 50. He says, flee out of Babylon. Leave the land of the Babylonians. And again in chapter 51, verse 6. He says, flee from Babylon. Run for your lives. And as I said before, I believe this looks historically at the destruction of Babylon, but I believe it also looks prophetically at the end as well. Listen to this as Jeremiah continues. He says, do not be destroyed because of their sins, or because of her sins. It is time for the Lord's vengeance. He will pay her what she deserves. Babylon was a gold cup in the Lord's hand. She made the whole earth drunk. The nations drank her wine. Therefore, they have now gone mad. And doesn't that sound a whole lot like Babylon at the end times we've been reading about in chapter 18? Listen to this in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 8. Babylon will suddenly fall and be broken. Wail over her. Get balm for her pain. Perhaps she can be healed. We would have healed Babylon, but she cannot be healed. Let us leave her, and each go to his own land, for her judgment reaches to the skies. The judgment is so severe that God says, get out. And again in verse 45, come out of her, my people, run for your lives, run from the fierce anger of the Lord. And so you can see how much this vision of chapter 18 of Revelation draws upon the warnings of the Old Testament prophecies about the final destruction of Babylon. The angel cries, come out of her. Back in verse 4, he says, come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins. Get out of there so you're not caught up in the wickedness of that place, so that you don't share in the sin that's there. And secondly, so that you will not receive any of her plagues. So he says, separate yourself from her sin, separate yourself from her altogether, that you may not receive her plagues. Now this is probably not the plagues referred to in the bowl judgments of chapter 16. I wouldn't think it would be that, because the 7 bowls are a final judgment. The 7 bowls are all over the world. And so there would be nowhere to escape to. There's no escape. However, it's clear in this text that some people will leave the city of Babylon. They'll get away, they'll view it from a distance, and they'll be able to see whatever's happening in Babylon, and they will be weeping and mourning over the city of Babylon. So what we see here that's about to be unleashed, these specific warnings are indicative of the judgment that's going to fall on the capital city of Babylon before the final judgment falls on the world. Therefore, the believers are warned to get out, to separate yourself from the sin, from the iniquity of that city, from the wrath that's about to fall. And it's all kind of reminiscent of Genesis, isn't it? If you remember the story of Lot with Sodom and Gomorrah. And so again, God says, leave, get out. And so this is a clear call for those who are the Lord's to separate themselves from the system of the world which is about to be destroyed. This kind of call has come in every generation. As I said, you can go back to Genesis chapter 19, and you'll find the very same call being made to the people of God in a very similar situation when Sodom and Gomorrah are about to be destroyed. You find it also in Numbers chapter 16, where God tells Moses to warn the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dahan and Abiram. I'm trying to remember the names. And Moses said in verse 26, move back from the tents of these wicked men. Do not touch anything belonging to them, or you'll be swept away because of their sins. Again, you read it in Matthew chapter 24. Jesus speaks to the people of the second coming. And in verse 15 he says, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, or in other words, get out of there as fast as you can. And in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, we're warned, do not be yoked together with unbelievers, for what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Therefore come out of them, verse 17, and be separate. And Paul here is quoting from Isaiah as well, saying, touch no unclean thing. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 11. And so you have it again in 1 John chapter 2. Verse 15 says, do not love the world or anything in the world. You have it again with Noah, to a wicked and rebellious people who brought destruction on the entire world. You have it in Jonah's warnings to Nineveh. Get out of that place because God is going to destroy it. And so the warning is, don't be seduced by the world. Don't be seduced by its iniquity in any age, and particularly in this last age, in this time of Babylon the Great. And so wherever there's idolatry, wherever there's prostitution, wherever there's self-glorification, wherever there's pride, wherever there's complacency, wherever there's reliance upon wealth, wherever there's indulgence or pleasure, wherever there's violence, there's a Babylon, a system of Babylon, and God will judge that sin. And verse 5 says, her sins were piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes. Now that word piled means literally to be glued or welded together. Her sins have piled themselves up to like a building, a new Tower of Babel. You know, it's been cemented together. They're built up. The ancient Tower of Babel, if you remember, didn't reach the heavens. But the sins of Babylon the Great will. And God says her sins are piled up to heaven. And God has remembered her crimes, her iniquities, and every sin. Go back to chapter 16 and verse 19 for a moment. Revelation chapter 16. Verse 19 says, the great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. Now I believe this may very well be the specific point when the fury of God's wrath and judgment falls on Babylon. Jeremiah tells us of these words of God in chapter 31, in verse 34. He says this, I will forgive their wickedness, and I will remember their sins no more. But for the wicked, unrepentant Babylon, there is no forgiveness and only judgment. So God says one more time, get out, because the world is headed toward a worldwide economic boom, centered in the New Babylon, ruled by a one-world government, by the Antichrist, who will demand that the world worship him as God, and God will not put up with it any longer. God will destroy it. He's had enough, and he's going to start by destroying the capital city of Babylon. Continuing reading through verses 6 and 8, or 6 through 8, here again we find the angel is speaking with great authority, but we see here now that the angel is now speaking to God and not to John. And so we're eavesdropping in this conversation with God, and the angel says, give back to her as she has given. Pay her back double for what she's done. Mix her a double portion from her own cup. Give her as much torture and grief as the glory and luxury she gave herself. In her heart she boasts, I sit as a queen, I am not a widow, and I will never mourn. Therefore, in one day, her plagues will overtake her, death, mourning, and famine. She will be consumed by fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And so the angel says to God, give back to her, pay her back. And it's the same language, the same prayers that the saints have been praying for millennia. If you remember, the saints under the altar back in chapter 6 were praying that way. No doubt through the whole tribulation, the saints have been crying out for judgment. And now the angel joins the call, and it's an echo of the Old Testament law as we know it. You know, it's an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Pay her back is time for vengeance. It's time for destruction. Enough grace has been given. Enough preaching has been done. It's time for destruction. The whole world has heard. They've heard and heard and heard and continually they refuse to believe. She's going to get what she deserves because she has desecrated the truth of God's word. She's dishonored God. She's rejected his Christ. And so give her what she should get. And so we find it's very strong language. It's strong language, but it's biblical. You see, the angel is merely echoing the voice of the psalmist and the prophet. The psalmist often prayed for the destruction of their enemies and the enemies of God, the enemies of righteousness, and so did the prophets. And now the angel calls for it. But for us as believers, we're in a different place. We're to be kind to our enemies. We're to love them. We're never to repay evil for evil. We're never ever to take vengeance against